Now that we've explored the properties of a form, we're going to cover the properties of controls. Now, control properties differ depending upon the type of control that's selected. For example, a label has different properties associated with it than a text box or a combo box. I'm going to double-click the Order ID text box. So what we're looking at are the properties of a text box. If I go to the Format properties, we can modify, for example, the format of that text box. And we can pick from predefined formats, or we can enter a format of our choice. So for example, if I select the Order Date text box, notice that the format has been set to DD-MMM-YYYY. And that determines how that order date is going to be displayed. If I want to modify the format, I can change it to something else, such as this medium date. I can also determine the number of decimal places that's displayed if this were a number. I can determine whether that control is visible. Now, many of these properties are set more at runtime than design time. An example of where you would modify the visible property of a control at runtime is if you were asking if the payment was check, credit card, or cash. If the payment was either cash or check, there would be no reason to ask for the expiration date. So you might actually want to hide the expiration date control. Display when determines when that particular control is displayed. You can have it always displayed, or you can have it displayed only when printing or only on the screen. There's other options such as scroll bars, can grow, can shrink, and a lot of other formatting options that are available for the control. When it comes to most of these formatting options, I set most of them using the formatting toolbar. By modifying these properties with the formatting toolbar, the properties are modified appropriately within the Format tab in the appropriate property. If I go over to the data properties of my text box, this is where that text box is getting its data from. Remember when we had our combo box, the customer ID field was the field where we were getting our data from to populate this text box. The input mask that you enter here will serve to augment or enhance the input mask that's set at the table level. It's very important, just as with a query, that you don't use an input mask here that conflicts with the input mask that's used at the table level. If you do create a conflicting input mask, then you won't be able to enter data into your form. Default value will actually override the default value that's set at the table level. And you can also, again, enter a validation rule and validation text that are different than the validation rule and validation text set at the table level. Once again, though, it is very important that the validation rule for the control does not conflict with the validation rule for the underlying table. If it does, you will not be able to enter data into that control. Enabled is an important property. Let's see what happens if I disable the Order ID control. Notice when I run this that the Order ID control actually appears dim. So I can't enter data into it, but it also appears dim. And this is something that you may not want to do. Instead, rather than disabling that control, you want to set enabled to yes, you might want to lock it. Locking it does not change its visual appearance, but it does keep anyone from doing data entry into that control. So you can lock control rather than disable it. I'm going to go to order date and show you that if I lock order date, I can't enter data into it. Although it looks normal, I could select it, copy it, and so forth. If we go over to the event properties of the control, we're not going to be covering these here. The event properties are going to be covered throughout other sections in the training series when we cover coding behind the events of controls. The Other tab allows you to specify properties such as the name of the object, what appears on the status bar when that object has the focus, and other options for that particular control. We're going to take a look at enter key behavior. In order to do that, I'm going to close this form right now, designate yes, I want to save changes to it, and we're going to look at the employees form that we created earlier. I'm going to go into the employees form in Design View, and I'm going to add a control to this form. I'm going to take the picture, and I'm going to move the picture, and I'm going to take the notes field, and I'm going to add the notes field to my form. Now what I'm going to do is go into Form View. If I were to press Enter on this control, notice that I go down to the next line. Enter again, and I move this down a line. If I go into Design View, let's take a look at the properties for that notes control. If we look at the Enter key behavior, it's set to New Line in Field. If I set it to default, let's see what happens. If I set it to default, when I press Enter, I actually tab out of that control. Let's try that again. I press Enter and I tab out. If I really wanted to put a hard return in, I would need to use Control Enter, and that has the same effect as Enter does if I set the property to New Line in Field. So this is another important property. Another important property is whether a field is a tab stop. If I go into Form View, notice that the employee ID is a tab stop, which really doesn't make any sense. The reason it doesn't make any sense is because the user cannot enter data into the employee ID. So what I'm going to do is set its tab stop property to no. By doing that, notice that now I never tab to that control. I tab right to the title. So I tab by that control. So you can see that by setting the properties of forms or controls, you can customize exactly how that form and the controls on it behave. Let's talk quickly about the difference between bound, unbound, and calculated controls. All of these controls are bound in that they display data from the record source. If I go into Design View and I select an image control and place that image control in a header of my form, let's view Form Header Footer, grab an image control, and place that image control in the form header. I can select an image. I'm going to go with my Occasion logo, which is one of the sample files. And notice that I've added a control to this form. This control is unbound. It's not bound to any underlying data. So this is an unbound control. Our bound controls all have their control source properties filled in. An unbound control does not have the control source filled in. We also can add calculated controls to our forms. I can take a text box and I can add it to my form, and I could say years employee. I can click to select the unbound control, and I can turn it into a calculated control by setting its control source to the date difference, which is a function, equals date diff. I want to know the date difference in years between today's date and the hire date. So I'm going to enter hire date, and I'm going to enter the date function. So now I've created a calculated control. Let's see if it works. If I go into Form View, I can see there's 7 years that have gone by since May 1st of 1992. And as I move from record to record, I can see how long that person in years has been an employee.